We will now begin with our academic session 4, Contemporary Legacies of Kant, and it's my pleasure to welcome all you here. I would now like to respectfully invite our esteemed chair of the session, Professor Ravindra M. Singh, to take his place on the stage. Joining us online from Australia, we have Professor Ian Hunter. Professor Hunter is Emeritus Professor at the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences in University of Queensland, a leading scholar of early modern political thought. His work focuses on intellectual history and theory. One of his notable publications include The Secularization of the Confessional State. I now invite Professor P. Kesava Kumar to the stage. Professor Kumar is Professor of Philosophy at University of Delhi, specializing in Indian philosophy, ethics, continental philosophy, and Dalit studies. His work engages with social justice and political thought. He has published extensively on Ambedkarite philosophy and contemporary issues. Finally, we have Professor V. Sanil on stage with us. Professor Sanil is Professor of Philosophy at IIT Delhi, working in continental philosophy and critical theory, philosophy of technology, social sciences, and aesthetics. His research connects philosophy with contemporary theory and culture. His recent works include Collywood choreography. Having introduced our speakers, I now turn to the chairperson of this session, Professor Ravindra M. Singh, Professor of Philosophy here at University of Delhi, specializing in philosophy of mind, continental philosophy, and phenomenology. We are honored to have such an eminent panel with us today. We look forward to your stimulating talks. Over to you, professors. But before that, we will start with felicitation of the ceremony. Guys, can you please come on?
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this second last session of the day. I just want to make very small announcement that each speaker will be getting 50 minutes, right? 35 minutes for presentation, extendable by 5 minutes. So maximum up to 40 minutes and 10 to 15 minutes of question answer discussion session. So I hope all the speakers will bear this in mind while making their presentations. May I now request Professor Hunter to begin his presentation. Professor Hunter?
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. I take it you can all hear me. Those of you who have looked at the abstracts will realize that I'm here under false pretenses. Because I'm an historian, not a philosopher. So I begin by thanking Professor Mitra for smuggling me in to the land of philosophers and Dr. Agarwal for showing me around. I talk about the current relation between Kantian philosophy and biblical ecclesiastical Christianity. And I begin by observing that this discussion is typically carried out under notions of the Enlightenment, and that it assumes two main forms. On one account deriving directly from Kant, treats Christianity as the historical symbolic vehicle for a Kantian pure religion of reason, die reine Vernunftsreligion, that is held to be latent within Christianity. On this view, biblical Christianity must be interpreted symbolically if it is to avoid lapsing into literalism and superstition. According to a second account, in setting limits to reason to make room for faith, Kant showed how faith and reason might be reconciled within religion itself. This view supports the idea that religion might itself be enlightened, which is a theme explored in a literature dealing with various religious enlightenments. I argue, however, that neither of these accounts can provide historical insight into the relation between Kantian philosophy and biblical ecclesiastical Christianity and Judaism in Germany at the end of the 18th century. For while it is true that some contemporary theologians and philosophers did regard Kantianism as providing a philosophical foundation for their religions, this view was confined to those who had become adherents of Kantian philosophy. For many others, rather than being a philosophy of their religions, Kantianism was itself a kind of religion, since it was competing with the ecclesiastical religions on their own theological and liturgical terrain. Kantianism was regarded as a cultural threat to be negotiated rather than a universal rationality to be embraced. To investigate the positive and negative reception of Kantian philosophy among the Christian and Judaic religions, then, we must first understand how these two different views of it, as philosophical foundation and as religious rival, came about. In 18th century Germany, rather than being two domains cleanly separated by opposed faculties of reason and faith, philosophy and religion were two overlapping and intermeshing cultural fields. This was in part because philosophy was taught alongside theology in seminaries and universities designed to form the clergy, teachers, and officials of deeply religious societies. But it was also because a good deal of modern philosophical thought had been generated through continuous improvisation on the psychological, Christological, and cosmological doctrines of Christian metaphysics. All claims to distinguish philosophy and religion or philosophy and theology were thus strategies for reconfiguring the overlapping fields on behalf of competing cultural and political programs, and so too Kant's. Kant's distinction between philosophy and religion was a variation on his distinction between, quote, rational and historical cognition. He understood rational cognition to be the generation of knowledge from a priori principles and archetypes contained in the mind. In contrast, he characterized historical cognition as knowledge derived from empirical data and positive instruction, in which he included instruction in the revealed doctrines of biblical ecclesiastical religion. I've argued at length elsewhere that Kant's conception of philosophy as the transcendental retrieval of a priori cognitive and moral principles from pure reason should be regarded as part of a practice of ascetic self-transformation. This took place as an exercise in transcendental self-reflection that was configured by his model of man as a double-natured, sensible and rational being, and by a Christian Platonic model of archetypal intellection. If this account proves tenable, then the Kantian distinction between philosophy and religion will dissolve into its historical circumstances. If Kant's models of transcendental self-reflection and archetypal intellection are no less dependent on positive historical instruction than the doctrines of the biblical religions, then Kantian philosophy and ecclesiastical Christianity will share the same mode of existence. This will be regarded as they will be regarded as historical forms of spiritual life shaped by positive doctrines, ascetic exercises, and solemn rites of the mind, aimed at achieving a higher kind of self. This is not a matter of theoretical possibility, however, but of empirical historical contention. For as we shall see, many leading humanist theologians did indeed regard Kant's philosophy as the product of positive doctrinal instruction. As a result, they point-blank refused to accept that it was the source of the timeless, pure religion of reason concealed within historical Christianity. This historical controversy foreshadows the need to recast our understanding of Kant's conception of religion, that is, his conception of it as a body of merely positive teachings, one of which, the Christian New Testament, has served as the historical vehicle for the archetypal intellect. For this conception will now appear as a hermeneutic power play designed to subordinate the biblical ecclesiastical religions to a Kantian spiritual practice. In light of this reconfiguration of the relations between philosophy and religion, it becomes possible to develop a new understanding of the reception of Kantian philosophy within German Christianity and Judaism at the end of the 18th century. Rather than taking place as the eruption of a timeless transcendental reason within historical religious doctrines, reception assumes a quite different and entirely historical form. It can now be understood as a series of unpredictable clashes and negotiations between competing institutional practices of intellectual and spiritual life. These took place in a volatile cultural political field defined by two poles. One of these poles was formed by a novel spiritual practice in which a philosophical elite pursued its own moral regeneration through Kantian philosophy. The other was formed by the metaphysical and liturgical infrastructure of the confessional religions from which Kantian philosophy had been improvised and that the Kantian elite now sought to remake in its own image. So let me start with the Lutheran reception. If Lutheran academic culture provided the prime reception context for Kantianism, that is because to a significant degree, Kantian philosophy was a product of this culture. Here two observations are required. First, the key Lutheran reception centres, the Tübingen Seminary and the philosophy and theology faculties at Jena, Halle and Königsberg, formed the apex of an educational pyramid. Through this pyramid, pious households and humanist grammar schools supplied these centres with a steady stream of serious-minded young men destined for spiritual vocations. As a result, these institutions of higher learning occupied a unique place in Lutheran culture. They housed the tiny intellectual elite that had acquired an interest in uncovering the hidden principles of knowledge and morality. This interest was incited through the cultivation of spiritual athleticism and the pursuit of a higher spiritual self within closed institutions of moral formation. Second, to a degree and in a way that has not been sufficiently understood, Lutheran academic culture supplied Kantian philosophy with core elements of its intellectual and spiritual architecture. At the centre of Kantian philosophy sits the figure of double-natured man. Kant initially elaborated this figure by positing the twin faculties of understanding and sensibility as the means of structuring the exercise in transcendental deliberation in the first critique. He subsequently augmented this figure by superimposing on it the Platonic relation between archetypal and ectypal intellection that would structure his practices of moral and religious reflection. Kant obtained his core model of double-natured man through a brilliant reconfiguration and repurposing of the Lutheran model of double-natured Christ. In doing so, he transformed its liturgical role from Eucharistic regeneration to philosophical ascesis. Here, it would structure the twin ascetic exercises in which apprentice philosophers would learn to attend to and act on themselves with the aim of becoming a higher kind of being. In the first instance, the figure of man as a sensibly affected rational being was the means by which apprentices learned to attend to themselves as rational beings swept by chaotic sensible impressions, thence to seek intellectual clarity through transcendental reflection on synthetic a priori operations of the mind. Second, this figure also allowed them to view themselves as archetypal intellects dimly glimpsed in the ectypal sensible world, thence to seek spiritual transformation by beholding the archetype of the moral law. As first-generation Kantians at Tübingen, such key figures as Schelling, Hölderlin, Badilli, Niethammer and Hegel were steeped from childhood in the Eucharistic figure of double-natured Christ. They were also required to swear fealty to this figure in the Lutheran Articles of Faith, that is the formula of concord, as the condition of holding office as Lutheran clergy, teachers, theologians and philosophers. When these philosophical apprentices first encountered Kant's double-natured man and its liturgy of transcendental reflection then, it was not as something alien. It appeared on their spiritual radar rather as an exciting and possibly schismatic variant of the Lutheran Eucharistic culture in which they had been formed. The reception of Kantianism within Lutheran intellectual culture thus did not take place as a clash between a philosophy of pure reason and a religion of positive doctrinal inculcation. It took place rather as a series of unpredictable encounters between two wings of a shared field of spiritual practices. One wing was centered in an individual practice of philosophical self-reflection and self-clarification undertaken by precocious Kantians. The other found its center in the teachings and observances of the Eucharistic Lutheran Church and in the culture of humanist erudition in which biblical Lutheranism was embedded. Despite their manifest differences, there was no sharp boundary between these wings. That is because the two figures of Christ, the one that Kant turned into a symbol of philosophical self-regeneration, and the one whose two natures promised redemption in the Lutheran Eucharist, remained institutionally adjacent in the Lutheran Church and University. Some young Lutheran intellectuals would cross this border with the thought of passing from communal Eucharistic redemption to autonomous philosophical self-generation. Others, though, sought to defend the border to maintain the spiritual life of the Eucharistic community against the schismatic religion of its philosophical elite. So the positive reception of Kantianism at Tübingen took place in the form of a spiritual insurgency in which junior lecturers and students converted from Lutheranism to Kantianism. Crossing over the bridge of Kant's double-natured man, the future philosophers Schelling, Hölderlin, Niethammer, Weideli, Hegel began to write academic theses and to deliver sermons on the moral law, began to write Kantian academic theses and to deliver sermons on the moral law in the seminary's academic church. This allows us to understand why most first-generation Kantians were training to be Lutheran clergy and teachers. It also explains why early Kantian textbooks and lecture courses were overwhelmingly produced by Lutheran Kant converts, and why all began by instilling that man is a double-natured being composed of a chaotic sensibility and a synthetic understanding. In passing through this conversion portal, the philosophical apprentices would come to accept that Kant had single-handedly recovered the transcendental principles of knowledge and morality from his own mind, thereby supplanting biblical ecclesiastical religion with the spiritually grounded, pure practical, with the spirituality grounded in pure practical reason. The negative reception of Kantianism in Lutheran academic culture arose from two overlapping sources. In the first instance, it was driven by Lutheran biblical theology, as advanced by the formidable director of the Tübingen Seminary, Gottlob Christian Storr. Storr was familiar with Kantian philosophy and even approved of Kant's moral proof of divine existence. At the same time, however, he erected a barricade in the middle of the bridge across which the young converts sought to pass from Lutheranism's double-natured Christ to Kant's double-natured man. Storr thus repudiated Kant's hermeneutics and turned the Bible into an allegory for philosophical self-regeneration. He did so by using humanist biblical criticism to defend the historical authenticity and moral authority of the gospel of Christ. In so doing, he taught that regeneration was available only through Lutheranism's double-natured Eucharistic Christ to the exclusion of Kantianism's double-natured philosopher. Storr thus sought to defend the Lutheran Church against its schismatic philosophical rival. The second source of Lutheran resistance to Kantianism came from the humanist disciplines of philology and biblical criticism and biblical and ecclesiastical historiography. These were headquartered at the University of Göttingen, where a formidable phalanx of scholars, J.D. Michaelis, J.G. Eichhorn, J.L. Mosheim, rejected Kant's philosophical hermeneutics of the Bible and his philosophical history of religion, and cited two grounds for doing so. First, they argued that Kant failed to supply any textual or contextual evidence that the Bible actually contained a latent pure religion of reason. Drawing on the accumulated wealth of post-Renaissance humanist erudition, these scholars approached the Bible as an archive of revelations deposited in several languages and migrating through various translations, canons, and interpolations over 2 millennia. The historical meaning of the Bible could only be understood by those who had mastered these languages and possessed the, quote, grammatical historical method capable of revealing the customs and ethics of the biblical peoples recorded in the gospel books. Since Kant and his followers lacked mastery of these scholarly disciplines, rather than exegesis, Kantian biblical hermeneutics, they argued, should be regarded as the Kantian school's deceptive interpolation of its philosophy into the Bible. Second, the members of this cohort refused to accept that Kantian philosophy was grounded in, quote, unlearnable transcendental self-reflection. They argued that, like all philosophies and theologies, Kantianism was grounded in the inculcation of positive doctrines or dogmata, and that it constituted only one among the historical philosophical schools that periodically attempted to annex Christianity. Moving on to the Catholic reception. The Catholic reception of Kantian philosophy in the late 18th century took place on the same historical terrain as the Lutheran. In other words, it did not signify an epochal clash between the free exercise of philosophical reason and a moribund religious dogmatism. It too took place in the form of unpredictable competition between rival bodies of philosophical theology, spiritual practice, and liturgical observance that Kantian philosophy unleashed within academic religious cultures. The Catholic reception of Kantianism, however, differed from the Lutheran in three important regards. First, it did not take place until after the dissolution of the Jesuit teaching order in 1773. In jeopardizing the role of Thomist scholasticism as the philosophical foundation of Catholic theology, the suppression of the Jesuits opened a space for such interloper philosophies as Kantianism. Second, despite this, the long shadow of Thomism meant that Kantianism did not emerge from within Catholic theology as a schismatic splinter movement, as it did within Lutheran academic culture. Instead, by rejecting as, quote, dogmatic the entirety of Thomist metaphysics and theoretical theology, Kantian, quote, critical philosophy appeared in academic culture as a foreign body. For this meant that Kantianism threatened to destabilize the philosophical teachings that underpinned the theological and liturgical order of the entire Church. Third, the official regulation of academic teaching differed significantly between the two religious cultures. In Lutheran territories of Germany, teaching was kept within the bounds of the Formula of Concord by local episcopal judicial committees or consistories. In Catholic territories, however, a single authoritative body of philosophical and theological doctrine, that is, Thomist scholasticism, was transmitted by the Jesuit teaching order that was headquartered in Rome and reinforced by two powerful papal judicial bodies, the Vatican's Congregation of the Faith and the Congregation of the Index. Since it remained in place even after the suppression of the Jesuits, this centralized regulatory structure meant that the appearance of such heterodox teachings as Kantianism could and did trigger a series of judicial referrals that reached from local bishops up to the Vatican. All of this meant that, as with the Lutheran, rather than being determined by Kantianism's philosophical truth or falsity, its Catholic reception was determined by historical circumstance. In the Catholic case, this was the circumstance in which Kantian philosophy surfaced as a competing spirituality within post-Jesuit universities that were still under local and ultimately Roman theological supervision. Two examples show how this played out in practice. The initial reception of Kantianism, the initial Catholic reception of Kantianism, assumed the form of a frontal attack launched by the defenders of Thomist scholasticism, whose leading German representative was the Jesuit metaphysician Benedict Stadler. To the extent that Stadler is known today, which is basically not at all, it is as a, quote, dogmatic opponent of critical philosophy and as a, quote, reactionary defender of Catholic orthodoxy. It is only after Kantian critical philosophy is itself seen to depend on positive doctrines or dogmata that Stadler can assume his proper place in the history of philosophy. He comes into focus as the formidable defender of the metaphysical infrastructure of Catholic theology, soteriology, and liturgy against a hostile Kantian rival. Given their scope, scale, and forensic detail, and they are massive, we can't pretend to do justice to Stadler's anti-Kantian works here, and can only content ourselves with two broad orienting observations. First, while he fully understood Kant's critique of theoretical metaphysics and defense of transcendental idealism, Stadler rejected them in favour of a metaphysical theology that was grounded in an updated Wolffian Thomism. This meant that he rejected Kant's account of the limits of human reason that turned God into an unknowable noumenon, with Stadler reinstating a positive theoretical theology of the divine being. It also meant that he rejected Kant's doctrine of the subjectivity of space and time. Stadler viewed this doctrine as philosophically ungrounded and as incompatible with a Trinitarian understanding of the world as a divine creation in which God had been physically incarnated as Christ as the condition of human redemption. Second, Stadler relied on Thomist moral theology to reject Kant's conception of morality as the determination of the will by thinking the idea of the moral law to the exclusion of all goods and ends. Formulating a position that would have a long future in Catholic anti-Kantianism, Stadler declared that determining the will purely by thinking an idea is impossible for human beings. Humans, he argued, can only will and act on the basis of the happiness promised by the realization of a desired end or good, ultimately leading them to the highest happiness or good, namely beatific vision of God. Stadler's virtue ethics should thus be regarded as a rival spiritual practice on the same historical footing as Kant's ascesis of moral autonomy. This meant that Stadler's Wolffian Thomism kept Kantianism out of the Bavarian University of Ingolstadt, not because of its greater truth, but because of the cultural and political circumstances in which it was taught, namely, due to the support that Stadler enjoyed at the Bavarian royal court, but only, as it turns out, for as long as that support lasted. The way that the Catholic reception of Kantianism depended on cultural and political circumstances that obtained in Catholic territorial universities can be further clarified in our second example. This is the reception of so-called new philosophies at the University of Dillingen. Dillingen belonged to the small ecclesiastical state of Augsburg, where, as both bishop and secular ruler, the Prince Bishop, Clemens Wenceslaus, had direct oversight of the university. In reacting to the suppression of the Jesuits by bringing in new academic talent, Clemens recruited the pastoral theologian Johann Michael Seiler and two younger philosopher priests, Joseph Weber and Patrice Benedict Zimmer. Unbeknown to the Prince Bishop, sometime prior to their appointments in 1781, Weber and Zimmer had converted to Kantianism, accepting Kant's doctrine of man the double-natured, sensible and rational being. They then used this to argue that knowledge of God could no longer be based in Thomist theoretical metaphysics, but could be grounded, as Kant argued, in the necessity of positing God for human moral purposes. This provoked a vehement backlash from the university's remaining Jesuits. They argued in the manner of Stadler that Weber's lectures were incompatible with Catholic doctrine and amounted to proselytizing on behalf of Kantianism as a rival religion. Clemens responded to this culture war by launching a commission of inquiry in 1793. This resulted in the banning of Kantianism until such time, as he said, as it had been shown to be safe for Catholic teaching. If these events provide a good pointer to the historical conditions governing the reception and fortunes of Kantian philosophy, then what happens next leaves no room for doubt on this score. For in responding to the Commission's negative findings and promising to refrain from all teaching of Kantian philosophy.
Excuse me, Professor Hunter, would you mind stopping a little for a few seconds? There's some network issue.
Excuse me?
We are not able to hear you. Could you stop for a few seconds so that we...
Yes, I can talk. I'm talking now. I'm testing. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now it's okay. Thank you.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just talking about what happened next after the negative results of the Commission of Inquiry, which is that Weber and Zimmer jumped ship to Schelling's absolute idealism. In doing so, they supplanted Kant's double-natured man with Schelling's single-natured subject of intellectual intuition, seeking to install this as a new metaphysical foundation for Catholic theology. In the event, Schelling's single-natured, quote, absolute I proved no less vulnerable than Kant's double-natured, sensible and rational being to the volatile cultural politics of the post-Jesuit Catholic University. Despite renouncing Kant in favour of Schelling, Weber was removed from his chair for heterodoxy in 1794 to be followed by Zimmer a year later. It turns out that the towering philosophical self, crafted through Kantian and absolute idealism, was dwarfed by the ungovernable cultural and political circumstances that permitted this crafting to take place or stopped it. Can you hear me? Is this loud enough?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, please go.
So finally, a few words on the Jewish reception. In late 18th century Germany, the social conditions of Jewish intellectual life differed markedly from those of Lutheran and Catholic academic cultures. This was so much so that talk a Jewish reception of Kantianism is perhaps best seen as only analogical in relation to the Lutheran and Catholic receptions. There are 5 points of difference to take notice of. First, unlike the Lutherans and Catholics, rather than forming a settled religious community embedded in the Constitution and occupying the heights of German religious, political and academic life, German Jews were a scattered religious minority still struggling to achieve basic civil and political rights. Second, there were no Jewish universities, churning out cohorts of serious young men preoccupied with their spiritual condition and destined for office holding as clergy, teachers and officials in powerful ecclesiastical and civil institutions. Jewish intellectuals were formed in a more piecemeal manner, in small religious academies or yeshivas, through rabbinical instruction and through autodidactic writing, reading and publication. Third, rather than being prosecuted through individual speculative Christological exercises in transcendental self-glorification, Jewish theological and philosophical learning took place in a different cultural and literary register, namely through erudite participation in a vast collective practice of commentary on holy texts. This was focused in the first instance on the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and then on the Talmud, the central compendium of rabbinical law, ethics and philosophy, and it generated knowledge through incremental commentary on the holy books and wisdom literature. Fourth, for this reason, Kant's philosophical hermeneutic teaching that the Christian New Testament was the only historical religious work that contained the timeless, universal, pure moral religion was entirely inimical to Judaism. This accounts for Kant's refusal to regard Judaism as a religion at all, and for his view of its ceremonial laws as the source of the superstitious rituals that had ruined ecclesiastical Christianity. Finally, in treating civil and political rights as grounded in universal a priori principles of pure practical reason, Kant and his followers argued that the Jews would qualify for such rights only after they had converted to a rational form of Christianity. This would be the first step toward the complete supplanting of all biblical ecclesiastical religions by the pure religion of reason. As with the Lutheran and Catholic receptions then, rather than enacting a clash between a priori reason and positive doctrinal religion, the Jewish reception assumed the form of an encounter between divergent practices of literary and spiritual life, with Jewish intellectuals taking up different positions amid the resulting clamour. In the Jewish case, however, Kantianism did not emerge as a splinter movement within a shared religious and academic culture. Owing to the Christological doctrines and ascetic exercises informing its model of double-natured man, Kantianism confronted Judaism as an alien and hostile spiritual culture. This meant that Kantians were intent on converting Jews to some form of Christian rationalism by withholding their civil rights if necessary. This led to the emergence of markedly different attitudes towards Kantianism within the movement to reform Judaism at the end of the 18th century. This was the movement that the Jews referred to as the Haskalah and has since been retrospectively baptized, I use the word advisedly, as the Jewish Enlightenment. On one side of this campaign, there were some Jewish intellectuals, most notably Lazarus ben David, who held public lectures on Kantian philosophy and argued that Kant's moral philosophy should form the basis for a reformed Judaism. In wrongly presuming that ben David was arguing for the conversion of the Jews to Christianity, Kant awarded him his imprimatur. In fact, ben David was arguing for something else, namely for the transformation of Judaism itself into a kind of Kantian moral religion. At the other end of the spectrum were those Jewish intellectuals for whom, rather than portending the transformation of Judaism into a Kantian philosophical religion, the Haskalah was centered in Judaism's literary and cultural revitalization. Here we find the towering figure of Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn focused his energies on such projects as supplying the Hebrew Bible with a German morphology to make it more accessible to German Jews and to raise the level of public religious discussion. But in his Jerusalem, Mendelssohn also took issue with the attempt to make the civil rights of Jews dependent on their conversion to some kind of rational religion. Judaism, he argued, was grounded not in philosophical reason, but in divinely revealed laws addressed to the Jewish people. This meant that the Jewish religion should qualify for civil protection under the German religious constitution, which, Mendelssohn correctly observed, recognized a plurality of religions regardless of their claim rationality and truth. The young Saul Asher adopted a similar stance. He argued more aggressively than Mendelssohn that the critique of revealed religion in Kantian and Fichtean idealism was itself grounded in a form of sectarian Christian rationalism. Should philosophical idealism be allowed to determine who could be regarded as German, Asher warned, this would foster a form of philosophical Judenhass, or Jew hatred, that would turn Germany's Jews into reviled outsiders. Standing to one side of this spectrum was the isolated figure of Solomon Maimon. Since he wrote extensively on Kantian philosophy, Maimon is often himself viewed as a Kantian, or, since he criticised Kant's models of double-natured man, perhaps even as a proto-absolute idealist. In fact, Maimon was neither of these things. Rather, he was an itinerant rabbinical sage operating outside German academic philosophy and within the tradition of Jewish commentary literature. Here he emulated the rabbinical sage after whom he named himself, Maimonides, and remarkably sought to integrate Kantian philosophy into the ancient tradition of Jewish wisdom literature. In conclusion, in treating Kantian philosophy as an intellectual ascesis, we have characterized it as an assemblage of strenuous intellectual arguments and spiritual exercises. Through these, elite ethical athletes learn to attend to and act on themselves with a view to crafting a higher philosophical self. This was a self characterized by transcendental self-clarification and moral autonomy. This upends our understanding of the reception of Kantianism within Germany's biblical ecclesiastical religions. It means that rather than understanding it as enacting a clash between a free a priori reason and historically inculcated positive faith, we can learn to see this reception in a different way. It can now be understood in terms of the fraught institutional interactions between the philosophical liturgies of Kantian academic spirituality and the ecclesiastical liturgies and theologies of Germany's Eucharistic churches and the sacred literacy of its Jewish community. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter, for sticking to the timeline. I think we have enough time to take questions from the audience. We easily have 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah, there's...
Hello. First of all, thank you for this session. I would like to know more about how did Catholic Church defend its position, especially on the matter of transubstantiation happening in the Eucharist and the dual nature that we see in Christology. And the second thing is that...
Can you be louder, please? Slightly.
Can you hear me now?
Slightly better.
Yeah. I'm just repeating my question. Can you please... Can you please repeat? I'm sorry. Can you please clarify the idea? How did Catholic Church defend its position, especially on the idea of transubstantiation that is happening in the Eucharist and the dual nature that we see in Christology? And the second thing is that, according to Kant, the religion should be on moral autonomy, not on any kind of ritualism. So, how did Catholic Church defend its conventional apologetics and teachings and dogmas? Thank you.
Well, they simply didn't accept that religion shouldn't be grounded in ritual. They said that it should be grounded in ritual. And they weren't happy at all with the idea of moral autonomy. They didn't think that moral autonomy was possible for human beings. It was only possible to be regenerate by belonging to the church and by engaging, for example, in the Eucharist. It was through the Eucharist, with the exchange of properties between Christ's two natures, that human beings became possible of overcoming their debt to sin. I don't defend any of that. I'm simply saying that was what was held. So when Kant came along and said, "No, I can show you that in fact, because we can't know the noumenon, we can only demonstrate that God is necessary as an idea for human reason. and to motivate moral practice and so forth, that was simply rejected. Nobody accepted that. Not
I think his answer is over. So maybe I think we again have some network issue. Yeah. I think Professor Inakshi had a question.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Professor, for your brilliant and thought-provoking question. So, sir, I am explicitly fascinated about your idea of exegetically philosophical convention that you mentioned, that how ecclesiastical services has to be defined in certain exegesis. So my question lies that if Kant sort of limited reason to protect faith, but also made faith to answer reason, did he actually want to secularize religion or sort of theologize religion in some sense? For example, and where do we see that tension playing out in contemporary academic discourse? Because you mentioned that contemporary relevance to the ecclesiastical discourse has been dynamic in some sense. So, what would have been the Kant's response into that, if ecclesiastical service has to be grounded in certain fixed sense?
Kant's view was that because the New Testament was the only historical text in which a pure religion of reason had entered the historical world, it contained the latent pure religion of reason, and that over time, the use of philosophical hermeneutics and the rereading of the Bible as an allegory for a more or less Platonic model of religion, we would overcome the merely ecclesiastical and biblical forms of religion and achieve the pure moral religion, which would be the eschatological endpoint of human development. That was more or less his view of that set of issues that you raise. But from the beginning, you had people in Lutheran and Catholic theological traditions who simply just didn't accept any of that. Their view, they refused to accept that there was such a thing as a pure religion of reason. They refused to accept that only the New Testament was the place where this was found. The Jews said that was ridiculous. And the Catholics said that their tradition, the tradition of Catholic theological commentary, the tradition of Thomist metaphysics, was simply untouched by the Kantian critique, and they just refused it. So if you look at the 20th century, to bring up your point about Kant and his contemporaries, if you look at what Alistair MacIntyre or Michael Sandel or Charles Taylor say about Kant, they just go back to Thomism and they say, well, that Kant has not understood the nature of human virtue. Human virtue cannot be understood, this is just them talking, not me. Human virtue cannot be understood in terms of a rational individual who governs itself through thinking the idea of a law. We have built into us certain ends and goods that have been placed there by God, and our lives are about realizing those goods within the guidance of the church. So those things were said at the end of the 20th century, for example, in the critique of Rawls and Rawlsian commentary on Kant by those Catholic thinkers. So we've never really gotten past the conflicts that have first emerged when Kantianism hit the fan in these places. That's the end of my answer.
Thanks, Professor Hunter, for this very informative talk. I just have, I came 5 minutes later, and also I do not have much exposure to this whole historical narrative about how, for the contemporary religions during Kant's time and all the narrative you gave. But I have two very simple questions, maybe out of my ignorance. That did you mention in the first 5 minutes perhaps that how Kant himself was influenced, how and whether Kant was influenced by the double-edged character of Christ, and another question related to this is that, if I'm not mistaken, Kant had talked about Judaism, Judaistic religion in his third critique, that where he spoke in an extremely commenting way that how Judaism said that against his paganism, against that any idol worship, that you should not, it was a complete prohibition of making any image or any finite emblem of what is unpresentable, what is so. With these two, and if you have time, I would also be rather curious to know that if there was any trend of religion which was secularism, or any trend of religion, or maybe a religion, atheism during that time, and how did Kant's philosophy influence those genres?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure that I can answer them all quickly. The question of the relationship between double-natured Christ and double-natured man is probably too big to go into right now. But if you look at the critique of practical reason, if you look at the section that deals with immanent mediation, and if you look at the way in which he constructs what it is to become moral by mediating between two different kinds of man, sensible man and intelligible man, my argument would be that this notion of mediation between two different natures is a repurposing of the mediation between Christ's two natures, because what Kant says is that this has to happen immanently. There can't be any other higher level through God or through any higher level entity or being that makes this happen. It's purely immanent between the two natures in man. Now, if that doesn't come from the model of the two-natured Christ, then we need to try and find out where it does come from. But my best guess at the moment is that is where it comes from. Regarding your other point, yes, of course, there were other religious traditions that at the time were opposed to, for example, metaphysical theology. Pietism in Germany was one of the main kinds of religion of this kind. So was neologism. And a lot of Kantians started out as pietists or as neologians. Johann Tieftrunk, for example, Purlitz, these were people that had studied at Halle under the neologians and had learned a kind of rational religion from which they could transit into Kantianism with very little strain and stress, because they'd already adopted the idea that Christ was not the God-man. He was just a teacher. And so Socinianism and Unitarianism were already on the agenda as a sort of breeding ground or as a sort of a background form of religion for Kantianism. And if you look at 19th century America, then you'll find that Unitarianism plays the same role. So if people like Emerson and Thoreau in mid-19th century East Coast America, these were people who'd been brought up in Unitarian doctrines, had already accepted that Christ wasn't God, and adapted to Kant very quickly as a way of saying we can nonetheless regenerate ourselves by acting on ourselves, in their case, through philosophy, through poetry, through contemplation of nature. So Kantianism, if you like, spread out into a whole lot of other adjacent fields. And in doing so, it carried people with it. But you're right, there is an iconoclasm built into Kantianism because of its anti-ritual character. So it rejects images, it rejects as idolatry, various kinds of ritual and so forth. But what the Lutherans and Catholics said was remove the beam from your own eye. What about your own ritual? What about your own liturgy? What about your double-natured man? Why should we accept that there is such a thing as double-natured man, as man with a sensibility and as man with reason? And pretty soon people that had accepted that, like Schelling, came along and said, well, of course, Kant was mistaken. There is no such thing as double-natured man. There's only single-natured man. Single-natured man is intellectual intuition. Kant was wrong. It's not just that God is not the only being that has intellectual intuition. We all do. We all create the object that we think, and the absolute I is the place where that happens. So one has to remember that these things, these arguments and these doctrines took place in an incredibly volatile context. That volatility is what I tried to characterize by showing what happened when a scholasticism, like Thomism, faltered due to external events and left room for a whole variety of other theologico-philosophical positions to develop, including Kantianism. That's the end of that answer.
I think we have two more questions. Yes, and Sabdashwa will be the next. He will have the last word.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for this really fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask about the claim that the two-natured conception comes from Christology. I mean, isn't there an easier parallel to find in something like the Greek picture of the human self? So there's, the reason driving the chariot in Plato's image, driving the chariot of the inclinations or the passions, and reason should be in control, and there's spirit, which is somehow mediating between the two, but really it's about reason dominating the passions, which looks a lot like Kant's sort of rational self over and against the sensible inclinations of the sort of natural self. So do you have to say that the real parallel there is Christ's two natures, or isn't it just this Greek picture?
No, you don't have to, and Kant himself used the Greek picture, absolutely. That's why I tried to say that at a certain point he superimposes the model of archetypal and ectypal intellection onto the double-natured figure. And that's part of the transition from the first critique to the second critique. It's a part of the transition from theoretical philosophy to moral philosophy in Kant. Absolutely. So it's not an either-or, far from it. And it's always a difficult empirical question to pick through the text and to work out what kind of balance you want to make between these possible sources.
Right.
But still treating this as a hypothesis for further research, what we don't...
Professor Hunter, could you stop for a few seconds? We again seem to be having some network issue.
I'll hold that thought.
Can you still hear us?
I can still hear you perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah, but we are not able to hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's restored now. Please go on. Sorry.
It's okay again?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so let me go back to answering Andrew's entirely proper question, which is that it's an open question to me which sources are in play and how do they work.
Yeah.
But what I would want to ask regarding the Greek one is something like this, that when Kant uses Plato, he typically uses him in order to produce an exercise that's sometimes called philosophical eros. The idea is that through beholding something glorious, you're transformed by it. Now, the fact of reason, that embarrassing feature of the second critique, is an example of philosophical eros. Here's this thing that comes out of nowhere and transforms us without us even thinking it. Now that I find fascinating. I'm not at all worried by it, unlike Paul Guyer and Alan Wood. But I don't think it's the same thing as the Christological model of interaction between sensibility and reason. The reason I say this is that the Christological model doesn't use the notion of philosophical eros. That comes out of the Platonic tradition. What it uses is the notion of immanent mediation between two natures. And Kant's long section on immanent mediation in the second critique is all about how human beings can be transformed when there's an exchange of properties between their higher and lower selves. And he gives it a lot of detail to that. Now, if you can find that in the Greeks in the same way, then I'm happy to say, okay, let's modify what I've said, let's modify what I've argued. But where I find it most prominent is in the Lutheran account of Christ. Not just the Lutheran account, the Lutheran and the Catholic account of Christ. Because the notion there is that it's the mediation between the two natures in which his divine nature is transformed into the human and the human into the divine, and he's abased and at the same time he elevates. That's critical to what Kant does. But again, I would say, I think that's an open question. And I think it's something that I need to think about further, but that's my thinking at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I should say I just recently ordered your book, so I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of the details when it arrives.
Oh, great. I'm pleased if anyone orders that book.
So this is the last question, a short one. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about not the theology of practical philosophy in Kant, but the ontotheology, the theology of metaphysics that we get to see in Kant, especially in how he conceives of the noumena, which he often uses the word limit. It's a limit phenomenon. There seems to be more stock placed in ancient Greek ideas such as Heraclitus and other, like nature loves to hide, and then basically mystical thoughts of strains of philosophy, even in Germany, pre-Hegelian, Meister Eckhart, Boehme, and these sorts of people who sort of transformed Christianity, the kind of Christianity that was prevalent, but also added elements from East European traditions and even throughout the world. So do you think that particular kind of ontological moment in Kant, which he doesn't develop too much, although it serves as the bedrock for a lot of his other claims, can be sort of read in this sort of a way, where a kind of mystery, inherent nature of mystery, hiddenness, something which doesn't want to show itself, like Egyptian myth, Isis, the god of nature who is veiled constantly. So these kinds of notions, I mean, yeah, if you have anything to say.
I wouldn't want to exclude those possibilities. I always want to ask, well, what's the textual evidence for them? Do we find Kant talking about Meister Eckhart? Does he talk about Boehme? We know he talks about Plato, but he doesn't talk about Plato all that much, and he doesn't show any evidence that he's read Platonic texts as such. It looks like he's got them secondhand through people like Brucker and other writers of this kind. Kant's not a great reader. He's a great thinker, but he doesn't read much. What he does read and what he lectures on, where he gets an enormous stock of his material, is from Baumgarten's metaphysics and Baumgarten's ethics. And these are extraordinary works, and with the new editions we have by Fugate, I've forgotten the other editor, but anyway, Courtney Fugate and the other editor, we've now got access to these extraordinary texts, and what you can see in them is that a whole array of the what we call the dogmata or the credos that make their way into Kant are things that are in Baumgarten, and in Kant's annotations on Baumgarten, that's exactly what he's writing about. So when he comes across Platonic elements in Baumgarten, he makes commentary on that, and he talks about, for example, what's the nature of the divine intellect. The divine intellect is one that brings its objects into existence and so forth. These are all things on which he comments in his annotations on Baumgarten. I'm guessing that he never looked at the German mystics, but he had found a lot that reflected on that stuff in the works, in the compendium of Baumgarten. That's the end of my answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunter, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.